Hello guys, and welcome back to another cold episode. On today's episode, we are taking a look at the best decks to play at Worlds. Now, I am not going to Worlds, so why am I telling you this? Well, this is more so just what I believe will be top decks at the Worlds event and at Worlds style events. Now, if you do not know the rules to Worlds, let me show you. This section here is what you need to know. All decks will be under the same Forbidden and Limited list. Each player uses 2 decks and can use from either at any point 6 total decks across the team, because there's 3 people per team. On top of that, there can at most be 3 copies of each card across all of the teams. If a card would be semi or limited or semi-limited, then the copies across all teams would be the limitation given. So, for example, Called by the Grave is a card that is currently semi-limited, meaning if multiple people wanted to play Called by the Grave, they would only be able to play 1 copy each. And then the third person wouldn't be able to play it at all. However, each team can designate 3 shared cards that all decks have the ability to play at the maximum amount of copies. Meaning, if an opponent, or if a player would want to play something like Called By, they could share the card across all of them, and then everyone could play the 2 copies. That's something to keep in mind in regards to this. So it's 6 total decks per team, and they have to share a card pool. So some decks that generally would be good in, in most circumstances, something like Snake Eyes, something like Crystron, etc., maybe get worse due to the fact that they require a lot of staples, or they require a specific engine or something along those lines. So keep that in mind. So, with that in mind, let's talk about the best decks at Worlds, or what to expect at Worlds. Now again, this is mostly for Master Duel, so I'm going to go through a bunch of these, and we're going to quickly go through them as well. We're going to start off here with the 2 decks that everyone is likely expecting. If I can find it, there it is. Malice and Ryzeal. Malice and Ryzeal are very clearly tier 1s. They are going to be the most represented decks because 2 reasons. 1, they do not share archetypes or staple cards or anything of that nature. You can play all of Ryzeal, you can play all of Malice with no real downside to playing one or the other because they do not really share a card pool. That's a nice bonus. But 2, they're very clearly far and away the best decks in the game right now. We saw this in the OCG, we see this in TCG, and we're seeing it now once again in Master Duel. Very clearly these are a step above everything else, and they will likely be decks 1 and 2 for 2 different players, right? So generally speaking, 2 players on each team are going to have their decks, or at least their first decks, pretty much auto-assigned. The specific builds, or what they're specifically going for, are more so up in the air, but generally speaking, Ryzeal and Malice, bada bing, bada boom. Let's talk about the rest of the decks, because I don't think there is another deck that, genuinely speaking, goes in tier 1. I think there's a pretty big gap, and the main reason that I think there's a big gap is due to the fact that you can't really play a lot of staples, which means decks that are capable of playing non-staples or archetypes that require a lot of engine or something along those lines and don't require a lot of those staples are going to be significantly better. So that is something to keep in mind, and I do believe that the 3rd best deck and the 3rd most represented deck is going to be, where is it? It would be... There it is. Momento! Momento fills all of the holes that you would want it to fill, right? It fills all of the criteria that you need it to fill. 1, it's an archetype full of engine, which means that it is very strong without a lot of non-engine. And when you can't share a whole bunch of cards and a whole bunch of staples, it makes it a lot better because it can play a lot of these non-standard staples, things like super polymerization, the goblin cards, etc., in order to just allow it more access. On top of that, since it plays the game basically entirely through engine and it doesn't lose to anything in particular besides the Roach, because everything loses to the Roach, I know. But outside of the Roach specifically, it still has access to play around things like Fuelos, Perulia, etc., right? And it can share cards very effectively as well with pretty much anything, making it extremely powerful. And it's just like a good deck right now. It doesn't really have a losing matchup into either Malice or Ryziel. Yes, it can lose to both, and yes, it does lose to both fairly regularly, but it doesn't consistently lose nearly as much as some of the other decks that we'll talk about in a second. So that is, I think, the number one third deck. I think this is likely to be the pretty standard three of. Someone's going to be playing Ryziel, someone's going to be playing Malice, someone's going to be playing Momento. Now, this is where things get interesting, because I think there's a lot of stuff up in the air. First of all, let's talk about Fiendsmith. Fiendsmith is an archetype that generally could be seen in a myriad of different decks. You could see it in Ryziel, dependent. Ryziel already is good, and it doesn't necessarily need the Fiendsmith engine, but if people are comfortable with playing, like, some other deck without the Fiendsmith stuff, or if they're like, oh, we don't really need the Fiendsmith stuff and anything, Fiendsmith really fits very well in Ryziel specifically. So, most likely what's going to happen is Fiendsmith is either going to be played in Ryziel, or it's going to be played as, like, a control strategy. Mostly that's what I'm imagining. You're going to be playing, like, Fiendsmith control with, like, some Bestials or what have you. That being said, there's one other deck that I do think plays very well with the Fiendsmith stuff, and that's Tyr. Tyr I'm going to put into Playable. I don't necessarily think that it is the best option, but I think that it could be played because it has an ability similar to that of Momento, where you can kind of just play, like, a bunch of engine and really pop off. And on top of that, you can play a bunch of, like, high power spells and traps and stuff like that to really help facilitate your gameplay with these, like, high power spells, such as, like, Grass and Super Poly and Triple Tack and all of this stuff that a lot of the other decks aren't necessarily going to play, right? Like, Malice and Ryziel aren't necessarily going to be playing those as much. So, there's that. For the most part, I don't think it's a bad option, but I just don't think it's a great option. Moving on, we have ourselves, what else do we want to talk about? You know what? Yeah, we'll talk about Tenpai right now. I think Tenpai is playable. The problem with Tenpai is that it requires a lot of staples as well, similar to that of something like Malice or Ryziel or what have you, which can be a bit of an issue. You could also play it with, like, a going second Sky Striker variant, which I'm just going to put Sky Striker and everything else. You're not going to play Sky Striker unless you're playing the Tenpai cards, but you could play Sky Striker Tenpai. I don't think that's, like, a terrible option, but it does require you to go second specifically, which isn't exactly advantageous. You could use it as, like, a more of a counter deck, and honestly, I'm going to put it in that category instead. But for the most part, I don't think it's going to be played a whole ton, similar to that of something like Stun, which I believe would probably be on here. I guess we'll use this one as Stun. Stun could be played, but again, I don't think it's going to be very good, but it could theoretically be played. I'm just going to put a whole bunch of things in here that don't really belong, and that aren't really going to see any play. Oh, sorry. Let's actually talk about Blue Eyes. Blue Eyes, I think, could be played. I don't think it's exceptional, and the main reason for this is because it doesn't really have a good matchup into either Ryziel or Malice, so your best option would be using it to kind of beat the other decks in the room, which is like, Blue Eyes is very good at beating every other deck, and it's not good at beating specifically the two decks that you need to consistently beat. You are going to consistently see Malice, Ryziel. Most players are going to be playing that and kind of nothing else. They're going to be playing either Ryziel or Malice, and your job is to kind of beat them, right? There needs to be a reason to play this deck outside of these two, and the answer is, like, Blue Eyes just really isn't there for that. I don't think it's terrible, but, like, I'd rather not queue up Blue Eyes against Ryziel. That sounds really bad. I'd rather not queue up Blue Eyes and have to contest a Malice board. That sounds really bad, right? Like, sure, I could potentially have enough hand traps, but again, that would require me to take up things like Valor or other such cards that generally other decks would probably want more. So for the most part, I don't really think it's a great option. It's not terrible, but I don't think it's great. What else? Branded. Branded's not great as well. It's just like a worse version of Tyr. I think Tyr has more playability and more usability because you can splash it with a whole bunch of stuff and play this like White Forest, Tyr, Fiendsmith, Horus style strategy that has a lot of oomph behind it, allowing you to kind of push through boards or really, you know, play under Max C or do this or do that or a bunch of other stuff like that. That Branded just doesn't really have access to. Yes, you still have access to the power spells, which is nice, which is why I put it in the counter deck, but for the most part, I don't really see it doing anything too notable that Tyr wouldn't do. It really requires you to play specifically Branded, and Branded doesn't really have a good matchup specifically against Tyr, sorry, not Tyr, specifically against Malice, but also against, like, everything else as well. Like, if Bestials are fairly common, which I don't think they will be, but if they are, that becomes really bad. Against Momento, like, it's just a worse version of Momento, so for the most part, Momento is just better, right? Like, it just does its job better, right? Ryziel has the ability to interact very favorably due to the fact that cross negates at point of resolution, meaning that if there is a way that you can, like, chain something or interact favorably in that regard, you could also just lose it. But that being said, Ryziel is still, like, a fairly decent matchup for it, so you could see it as, like, specifically a Ryziel counter, but for the most part, it's not going to be, like, a main deck people are going to be playing, because it just has such a terrible matchup, specifically against Malice. So, there's that. Tyr, I don't really think has that. Yes, Tyr can lose to Malice, due to things like Whitebinder and what have you, and like banishing and stuff like that. But Tyr also plays so many different engines and so many different things that you need to like answer, whereas like Branded doesn't really have that. A lot of Branded's umph is in like the end phase, where Malice, like Whitebinder, banish 3 guys from the opponent's grave before they go to end phase, means that they just don't really get any of their advantage, which really turns them off. Whereas Tyr is like an immediate advantage, which means Whitebinder is a little bit less effective, and stuff like that. So that is one of the big differences between them there. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Azamina. We have White Force on here. We're not going to talk about Azamina. This deck doesn't really exist. Bestial, we kind of already talked about. Bestials, I think, will be fairly decent as, like, additional bodies and stuff like that. But they're mostly going to be played with Malice. So you're probably not going to see them too much, especially with, like, Magnuma at 1, right? So they're probably just going to be played in Malice. You might see, like, a Bestial control variant in, like, Fiendsmith or something like that. But again, for the most part, I don't expect that. Centurion. Centurion's really bad. It has a terrible, no good, very bad matchup into both Ryziel and Malice. Malice is arguably better, but Malice also has such an insane amount of power behind its plays that you really have to answer, and Centurion doesn't exactly play well into hand traps, just generally, which is more or less what Malice does, right? They just draw a bunch of hand traps and hand trap you. You can play into it with Centurion, right? But that would also mean Centurion would not be able to play Bestials unless you're wanting to play Bestials with Centurion over Malice, or you don't play Bestials in Centurion, which is also kind of okay, but not great. You'd probably need some sort of secondary engine, otherwise you're going to brick pretty consistently and not really have the ability to play the game. So, I don't really see this doing anything. Unless Emery decides to show up and just have the Mandate of Heaven and decides I'm going to draw better than everyone else. But alas, Emery's just unique. Crystron. Crystron is just better Centurion. And even now, I'm like, there's not really a reason to play Centurion at any point here. That being said, it's not terrible. I think there is a world in which you could play Crystron, due to the fact that you could use it as, like, Ryziel, or as, like, as the Ryziel player, as a deck to specifically beat, like, Momento, or something. I don't know. Yeah, it's, like, not terrible against Momento. It has a fairly decent end board, which is nice, but it doesn't really do anything unique. It's similar in nature to Blue Eyes, where it's like, it's okay. It's fine. Yeah, we'll put it there. Drytron's really not doing anything. Neither is Cyber Dragon, neither is Code Talker, neither is Dangerous, nor you. This is like kind of an FTK deck, but it's really terrible. Dragon Link. No. I really tried. I don't think there's a world in which that works. Millennium. Millennium would just be Millennium Stun, so we'll just count that as Stun. Stun's not great. Exosister is pretty terrible due to the fact that not a lot of things are leaving the graveyard effectively, and it's just inconsistent. It just doesn't really have the capability of keeping up with a lot of these stuff. And I would imagine a lot of people are also playing things to specifically beat Ryzeal, which also would end up beating the Malice. Or, not the Malice, the Exosister stuff. So, not great. Fire King. Actually, Fire King is not terrible. The main reason for this is because it's a pretty good matchup into Ryzeal, because Destruction is not great against Fire King. Yeah, that's kind of it. It would mostly be specifically for... It would also be fairly decent into Momento, so you could use it as, like, a Ryzeal counter. If you wanted to use, like, the Fire King stuff, you could do a bunch of Fire King shenanigans, and you could play the Snake Eye engine as well, which is still fairly decent and allows you to get a whole bunch of bodies onto the field. So at the very least, you could do something along those lines to beat specifically Ryzeal or Momento or something else of that nature. So for the most part, I don't think it's terrible, and it doesn't... It also, like, doesn't have to share a whole bunch of these staples that you would normally see in, you know, the top decks, which is also fairly nice, right? Flunder is a fairly decent option as a counter deck as well. We saw it last year kind of as a counter deck as well against some of the other Link decks, specifically, I think it was against Fire King, which is kind of funny. But against Malice, it wouldn't be terrible. And against some of the other decks, it also wouldn't be terrible, right? Like, it'd be fairly good against Fiendsmith variants, but I don't know. I really don't think this is going to do anything. Maybe you could counter it as a counter deck, but it's really bad. It's really inconsistent. Yeah, I'll put it in counter deck, but it is inconsistent, and I don't really think it's going to be worth it. Horus would be more as an engine for, like, tier or something like that, but not really worth playing. Alistar's not really worth playing either. Kashtira is kind of a deck that could technically be a counter. The problem is that any of the decks that you would want to counter don't really care. Maybe Ryzeal cares? I guess, yeah. If you're able to beat... If, like, Ryzeal is able to go first, you're just kind of cooked. Like, you don't really beat Ryzeal in any capacity. Again, because of, like, Cross being able to negate at point of resolution. They could just negate your Fenris or what have you, and then deal with the rest of the field, right? It's like you summon a guy, and then they just pop everything else around the guy, which is, like, not great. And then against Malice, it's terrible. I guess it's fairly decent against Momento and, like, Fiendsmith variants of stuff. But even that's not great because of its inconsistency. I guess it'd be, like, okay against Momento. So if you're expecting a fair amount of Momento, it could be a counter deck. Yeah, we'll put it there. Same thing with Lab. Lab really needs to go first, but it does have the capability of just, like, auto-winning games due to things like Dimensional Barrier against Ryzeal or against Momento, due to Daruma Cannon against Malice. Stuff like that is fairly solid. On top of that, again, it plays on a different axis from pretty much everything else, which makes it a little bit better, unlike something like, again, like, I don't know, Malice. Malice, right? It doesn't need all of those staples that maybe something else would. Live Twin doesn't have its new support, so it's not really worth playing. But you could theoretically play, like, a Live Twin Fiendsmith stuff, but I don't really think it's worth it. Marincess isn't really worth playing. Reactor is not really worth playing. The only reason you'd see the Mathmech cards is to play it in Malice, but because they share a card pool, it would be I guess it wouldn't be too terrible because, like, the extra deck doesn't really matter. You're only ever going to play, like, one-ofs anyway. But for the most part, you really wouldn't play it. It dies to the same stuff that, like, Malice does. It dies to the same stuff that Ryzeal does. It's not really going to help all that much. So, no, sorry. Atlantean. Atlantean Mermail is actually very good. I think Atlantean Mermail is another deck that is genuinely well-positioned in the current metagame for this game, or for the Worlds in particular, due to the fact that Worlds specifically requires a shared card pool, which means if all of your monsters do not have to share a card pool and you can play a bunch of engine, again, similar to Momento, in order to win games, you're you're doing pretty good. On top of that, you can just, like, auto-win games going first due to a myriad of cards that just shut down the opponent. The Barrier Statue, the Minstrel to be able to, like, look at the hand and yoink a guy, Moon Glacia, again, for similar reasons, right? So a lot of these cards are just kind of auto-win cards against a lot of the strategies. So, yeah, very, very solid. Very solid option. Makanko's not really worth it. If you're going to play something like Makanko, you're better off playing something like Duel, but alas. Orcus isn't really worth it without the new support. Primate we kind of talked about with Blue Eyes. Blue Eyes is basically the only deck you would play with Primate. You could potentially, theoretically, play like Primate, Fiendsmith, Control stuff, but that would be pretty bad. That'd be pretty bad. Pendulum's not really going to see any play because dear Lanta, try playing Pendulum into Detonator. That sounds like a nightmare. Prank Kid's not very good. Punk's... Is Punk good? What would Punk do? Kind of nothing that any of the other decks wouldn't already do. Yeah. Yeah, no, you wouldn't realistically play Punk. I don't think there's an incentive to play Punk over anything else. It doesn't really beat anything in particular. It doesn't really have, like, a great matchup into anything in particular. It's not really, like, gonna not have to take up a whole bunch of staples that you may need for other decks. Yeah. Rescue Ace is kind of similar. Rescue Ace is, like, I don't know, just requires a bunch of... I guess it technically doesn't, right? Because, like, you're not playing Fiend or Snake Eye, anything. So you might be able to play Rescue Ace. But Rescue Ace seems so outdated. It just doesn't seem capable of keeping up. But I guess it's not terrible, right? I don't really see a purpose to playing the Rescue Ace stuff. Plant Link's not really worth it. Ritual Beast could be worth it. Ritual Beast being able to just go first and kind of auto-win games is not terrible, especially against things like Memento and what have you. By being able to just banish their stuff, it's not terrible. And also being able to, like, have a big board wipe in the form of Steeds is also fairly decent, right? Being able to, like, pop the Malice monsters or being able to pop, like, the Ryzeal monsters or something else. I could see it working. Baguska Turbo's kind of crazy, especially against Ryzeal. So, you know, if you know the matchup, you're probably not terrible off. But I don't know. I don't think it's going to do great. Runic's not really going to see any play. Ryuge, Sharks, Skull Servant. Snake Eye I actually could see being very playable. Mostly due to the fact that what other deck is going to use Fiendsmith? You could just throw it into the Snake Eye stuff, and that's fairly decent. This could be like a nice solid third deck, you know, alongside the Ryzeal and Malice. While Memento is very strong, it isn't going to... Like, it still loses to quite a lot, right? It also loses to just, like, bricking, right? But, like, it loses to hand traps a lot more. Whereas, like, Snake Eye doesn't necessarily do that. So you could go first and play Snake Eye and more effectively play around a bunch of stuff. You know. It also has one of the craziest end boards still, right? Being able to end on, like, Apo and the entire Snake Eye line is very solid, especially in the current metagame. Yes, Aggregator or X Aggregator is very powerful, but pretty much every other deck, and even Ryzeal itself without X, doesn't exactly have a great answer to the Snake Eye end board. So that's a thing. The biggest problem is, like, Snake Eye dealing with going second, which I think is a bit of an issue, right? It's not great into Ryzeal, it's not great into Malice, but I don't think it's terrible. I think it genuinely has a lot of merit in the fact that, like, it is a very strong going first, and it's not terrible going second into a lot of other decks if it has the ability to play some of these hand traps. But alas, it kind of depends. I just don't think it's that bad, though. I also don't think it's a counter deck. Sprite's not really worth playing in any capacity. I don't see a world in which Sprite makes sense to play. Yeah, it's nice, but it's just like, I don't know, it feels similar to that of Ryzeal, but just worse. So there's that. Sword Soul's not very good. There's not enough searching for Thunder Dragon. Even then, Thunder Dragon still sucks because, like, everything kills it. Trap Trick's not really worth it. Unchained could see play with the Fiendsmith variant as just an additional thing that you can do. This would mostly probably be a counter to Ryzeal specifically, because Ryzeal, like, popping cards is nice and all, but, like, who cares when your entire deck floats? But you would most likely play it alongside specifically the Fiendsmith stuff, so that you have that additional engine to just, like, go into and to force out additional interaction and to end on a stronger end board. But also, all of the Unchained end board is very strong right now. Being able to, like, yoink a Malice guy, being able to yoink a Ryzeal, being able to like, pop cards and to deal with, like, pretty much anything on the field. It's fairly solid. Also, being able to make DD Wave King Caesar is very strong as well. Being able to negate the Malice monsters and keep them in the banished zone is pretty strong. Being able to negate the summon of, like, off of the Malice field spell, or being able to, or not off the field spell, of like the traps and stuff like that. So yeah, it's not terrible. That being said, DD Wave King Caesar isn't great into Ryzeal, because I guess you could negate, like, ice, but who cares? Valmonica's not worth it. Voiceless, I could also see being a pseudo counter deck as kind of like a go first auto win style deck. I really don't know if this is going to be the case, but I could see it, so I'm going to put it in counter deck, but I don't know. I've just seen it a little bit more on ladder, and I wonder if that's probably just ladder. Probably. Okay, White Forest is... I think White Forest is playable. Similar in nature to Tier, it just kind of has the ability to auto-win games due to just high power level, and the ability to play through a lot of hand traps effectively. Like, it doesn't care too much about things like Imperm, or Valor, or what have you. It can also play around things like Perulia and Fualos very effectively as well, which is very nice. It also can play around Meowls fairly effectively as well, which is something of note, because I do think Meowls will see a fair amount of play due to Malice being as popular as it is. Maybe one of the players is playing Meowls. I don't think it's going to be too common, though, but there's that. Yeah, I think it has similar playability to that of, like, Snake Eye or Tier, where it's just kind of like, here's a good deck that has a strong end board. It doesn't necessarily have a specific matchup that it's good against, it's just, like, generally good, and it has a strong enough end board to kind of not really be beaten, and it has the ability to play through end boards, which is something. It's a little bit weaker, though, in regards to that. It also does get the ability to play the Azamina cards, which is very nice. Ubel is kind of similar to Unchained in some of its facets, but it's also similar to, it's more similar to that of Snake Eyes, where it's like, here is a strong deck that does powerful things. That's more or less it. It doesn't necessarily do anything specifically advantageous for any of the players, but again, if you're not considering, like, Mermail or Memento, you're probably going to start considering things like Ubel, things like White Forest, things like Snake Eyes, right? Unless you're specifically like, there's this matchup that we need to be able to beat with this other deck, so we're going to play something like Lab or Branded or Tenpai or something like that. But for the most part, I do think that these four here, along with some sort of variant on Fiendsmith, are going to be fairly common, with then, like, smatterings of these. You might honestly see more of, like, the counter decks, obviously, because if you know what your opponent's playing, you're probably more likely to play something that counters it, right? But that being said, you might just be like, nah, I just need to have a consistent, capable deck. We might also not see any of these decks. Like, genuinely speaking, there might not be, well, Blue Eyes we would probably see, but we might not see, like, any of these. We might not see Crystron, we might not see UL, we might not see any of those. I wouldn't be too surprised, but I would also be fairly shocked if the meta was so solved for them, which I highly doubt it is. But again, it's kind of just, can we beat Malice and Ryzeal? And if you can't, what else can we do? Similar to that of the Ubel Snake Eye meta last year, where it was like, everyone was playing Fiendsmith, or not Fiendsmith, Fire King Snake Eye, everyone was playing Ubel, and then from there, the third deck, some people were playing Tear, some people were playing Branded, some people were playing Voiceless Voice, and losing. Some people played Pearly, which, by the way, Pearly's not on here. I don't think Pearly's going to do anything. But yeah, there you go. That's going to be it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys did indeed enjoy, and I hope you're excited for Worlds. Thank you guys so much for watching, and remember to always stay frosty. Bye-bye.